Hey everyone, so One Piece chapter 1098 just came out, and we are probably reading the best backstory in One Piece right now, and that is no exaggeration, and I think anybody that read this chapter can understand why. I had a hard time believing for a long time that anything would top Robin's backstory for me, but we are only probably at the halfway mark, I want to say, maybe 60% mark of Kuma's backstory, and it's already in that territory for me personally, and I think I still need to wait for it to play out and then be able to sit down and binge read the whole thing, but today's chapter genuinely made me cry. And not like a tear up type of thing, because One Piece chapters, at points I've teared up. I think even the first chapter of Kuma's flashback, I teared up like a little bit during the clap scene. But I really haven't, I don't think a One Piece manga chapter that I've read weekly has made me actually legitimately cry since Whitebeard at Marineford. So it's been years, over a decade at this point for me, and this chapter did it. And I think that's especially impressive because I think especially with the weekly experience, you're only getting so many pages and it's split up over, what you get it once every 7 days, if not once every 2 weeks, depending on break weeks. I think it's very hard to build that emotional flow, but every single chapter of Kuma's backstory so far it stays with you in a certain way. So it's not like the previous emotions that you felt for Kuma and for Ginny, for me at least, they haven't really gone away, which is what makes this chapter such a heartbreaker, because it takes their story to such an extreme place. It's a place that One Piece has never gone before. So I talked about before, and people have brought up the possibility that, Bonnie might be a product of rape. And I personally felt, and I talked about this on stream, that One Piece would not go that dark. It wouldn't go that far, because that just feels a little bit too raw, too real, too beyond the scope of what you would expect in a shonen manga. And yet here we are. And it's not just the fact that that is what the subject matter of this chapter was. I think the execution of Ginny's story and bringing that concept into that subject matter into One Piece, Oda did it about the best that you could possibly do for a flashback that's going by at the pace that it's going by. Because it's not just that, Ginny was raped and forced to give birth to a child by a celestial dragon who once enslaved her, and I guess still technically enslaved her. It's everything. The fact that she was used, discarded, left to roam around with this illness that was slowly killing her the longer that she stayed out in the sun. And after being so cruelly used and discarded by the celestial dragon, she ultimately dies trying to get back to her one true love, Kuma, and passes away in his arms. Seeing Ginny as she once was, such a upbeat, positive, confident life force, and seeing her tragic last moments, the juxtaposition of the two, and the quick memories that we're getting back and forth of her and Kuma's dynamic, it is so absolutely beyond f***ed up. I really don't think we've ever seen anything this cruel happen to someone this kind-hearted and pure in One Piece. And it's not just what happened, it's how Oda did it. And I have tremendous respect for him kind of going out of his comfort zone as a writer and an artist with this chapter. Because usually when One Piece backstories kind of hit a major note of tragedy where a character dies, be that a hero look, be that Bellemere, whoever, Corazon, usually these moments are associated with lots of very big emotions, because that's kind of that's his specialty. I think really big emotions with characters yelling, sobbing, screaming, huge, vivid, exaggerated, ugly faces, ugly crying. That's kind of what I associate with One Piece moments of tragedy. Here, what Oda is depicting in that church scene is just so dark, and again, it feels so real. A subject matter that is maybe hits a little bit too raw and too vivid, too visceral, too close to home. I think that with this type of subject matter, Oda went with a scene that is far more muted, more subtle, more somber, more quiet. We do still get Kuma's ugly crying face, but there's not the usual, it's not like you contrast this with something like Heroes crying over Scarlet's death or something like that. Everything is much more muted, much more subtle, much more just heavy, melancholy, mature. It just lets the pain of the tragedy speak for itself and lets the reader feel it. And huge props to Oda for writing a chapter like this, writing a scene like this, writing a character story like this. For Ginny, of course, but for Kuma, this is just halfway through. It's just partway through his backstory. And I have a video on Tuesday that is delving into how Oda is writing this backstory on a totally different level than what he normally does for most One Piece backstories, because there is a certain formula that Oda sticks to that he is straying from and actually improving upon with this backstory in particular. So look forward to next Tuesday's video, because I'm going to go even further in depth there, just talking about a few other things coming out of this chapter. One thing that stands out, of course, is the unfinished artwork that a lot of people were talking about. I personally view that more so not as a sign of a problem, but rather just a reflection of the fact that Oda went so much harder in the artwork in terms of some of the shading that he was doing with this chapter, because Oda usually doesn't go that hard with, you know, light and shadow or anything like that. Like, we've read One Piece for thousands of chapters at this point. That's not really his forte. He does do that with Kuma scenes, where Kuma is basically being bathed in sunlight. And with this chapter, of course, Oda went pretty hard on that, with a lot of those scenes of Kuma basically being bathed in sunlight. And there was a lot of just important panels that Oda felt the need to make sure that he's doing all of the shading with light and shadow streaming into the church, and even with Kuma looking at Ginny's grave. So because Oda is doing all of this extra work artistically for this chapter, even if it doesn't stand out in terms of like a wow, look at all this intricate detail sort of way, kind of like, you know, when the crew rolled into Onigashima and we first got that big shot, the big detailed shot of Onigashima. This is more, it's still very high-end, high-quality artwork that Oda is doing that's a step beyond what he normally does for his usual chapters. It just might not pop out in that way. But I think it's clear reading this chapter that Oda did have to spend a lot more time with the drawing because of the amount of shading that he had to do. So if he's going really hard with the shading on some panels, you know, he's still only got a week to draw the whole thing. If he's taking that extra effort, maybe he bit off a little bit more than he could chew, and ultimately he realized at the end that he didn't quite have enough time to finish out the drawing for certain other panels. It's just the way it is. I'm glad that he went for something more ambitious, because I think it pays off with those church panels that did get that shading, particularly the final one where he's holding Ginny in front of the giant cross and everything like that. So again, unfortunately, we got some sketchiness earlier on, but it will be fixed down the line with the volume release, so I don't think it's a problem. If this turns out to be a thing where suddenly we start getting sketchy images every chapter from here on without some really good art to balance that out, then maybe we can start saying like, okay, maybe there's something up with Oda's health again or something like that. But for the moment, I think this is a once in a blue moon exception chapter where Oda clearly took the extra effort artistically for some things, and it probably just took him a little more time than expected, which left a few other parts slightly unfinished. But that's just the way it is. I view it more so in terms of like, wow, Oda really wanted to nail Kuma's backstory, so he's putting in more effort artistically than he normally would, rather than what's going on, why is he not able to finish out chapters anymore. That's just my assumption right now. Maybe I'm being too optimistic. That aside, we now have the Kuma and Bonnie situation. My simple assumption is this, and we can see the way that it goes. What we know is going to happen is that Kuma has to make some sort of deal with the world government, with the Celestial Dragons, to allow himself to be turned into a lab experiment. We know that is what happens. We know that he is separated from Bonnie during this, and we know that Bonnie does not ultimately know why Kuma made this sort of sacrifice, right? We also know that Bonnie no longer has the illness that she has. I think we can put two and two together and basically say that Kuma likely made some sort of a deal with the Celestial Dragons to be able to cure Bonnie. Why that's the case, how they're able to do that, we don't know. I would guess that Kuma is probably able to make the connection that if Ginny brought this disease back from Marijua, then it's very possible that the Celestial Dragons are the one that know its origin, its source, and so Kuma might have to just suck it up, go to the Celestial Dragons directly in the next 1 to 2 chapters, and try and bargain with them to try and find the way to fix this, right? It's possible the Celestial Dragons have an easy fix and just didn't feel like giving it to Ginny. That's entirely possible. I've seen some people say that Saturn's potential devil fruit, Ushionis, cause incurable illnesses in people that they meet, and also that sapphires, which are the jewel that's Bonnie suffering from at the moment, that the disease seems to proliferate, sapphires are associated with the planet Saturn. So I don't know the full details of that, but there's a small possibility that Saturn himself was the cause of all this, which I think would tie very nicely back with the Egghead Island story and the conclusion to that. But for the moment, let's just leave it at the general idea that Ginny got it from Marijua. Kuma will likely have to go to Marijua and try and figure out a cure through the Celestial Dragons. Whether the Celestial Dragons basically say that Saturn can cure it because he was the cause, or maybe they give him access to Vegapunk, who as the world's best scientist might have a shot at basically fixing this or counteracting it. Whatever it may be, no matter what, I think it's very, very likely that Kuma in the next 1 to 2 chapters goes to the Celestial Dragons in search of a cure and basically offers himself up as sacrifice for being able to heal his daughter, which he of course hides from her. And that would basically bring us back to the modern day events, where Bonnie is likely now found out that Kuma made this sacrifice for her, and Kuma, in the last moments of his life, is basically trying to get back to Bonnie, to help her, to save her, to say goodbye, whatever he's trying to do. I'm pretty sure that's the way that the Kuma story is going to turn out. If there is an even greater level of tragedy involved here, I can't think of it, but I think it is bad enough that Kuma is ultimately going to have to go beg for help from the very people that inflicted all of this pain and suffering upon him and his family and his loved ones and his daughter, and ultimately have to give himself back up to them to be used for their experimentation and then later on for their own amusement and pleasure. So let's see if that pans out next week, if we see Kuma going to make that deal. Is this the saddest backstory in One Piece? Again, where it's at right now, I think it's already got the argument, and with the way that it seems headed, I think it will have that title locked up fairly soon. So it is amazing that even at this point, this late in the story, 1100 chapters in, Oda is still finding ways to outdo himself. And lastly, I want to talk about 2 submissions from the Voice of the People, the highest tier of patrons. So X7 Strife said, "It's so ironic / weird to me that it was specifically the sun that progressed that sickness and took Ginny's life. The fact that Kuma literally raised Bonnie in the darkness while infusing her with hope by teaching her about Nika seems so interesting to me." So this is a point that several other patrons were bringing up as well that is really, really symbolically interesting, which is that the sun is supposed to represent freedom in a way. In One Piece, that is just what the sun is supposed to represent. That's why Luffy, the sun god, he's the god of freedom, etc, etc. The irony, of course, being that for Ginny and now for Bonnie, the sun is their prisoner. They cannot leave, they cannot bask in the rays of the sun, they're forced to stay indoors. They're unable to enjoy the outdoor freedom of the sun, and the sun is essentially their jailer, keeping them held down. It's a cruel twist on what the sun represents, but at the same time, it represents the fact that the Celestial Dragons completely robbed them of their freedom. Even once they're far away from the Celestial Dragons, they've gotten away, they can't escape the curse that the Celestial Dragons essentially put on them, which is preventing them from being able to experience freedom. They literally cannot experience the freedom of the sun, so in a literal and metaphorical sense, they have been denied the freedom of the sun by the Celestial Dragons. Then Joshua Sobachik brought up a great point. As we head into the final saga, I think we will be given even more dark scenarios and implications of what the Celestial Dragons have done, so to keep the story from becoming too grim all around, Gear 5th is invented to kind of balance that out in both the meta sense and in canon. In the meta sense, we the audience are given a breath of fresh air in the middle of all the dark stuff when Gear 5th comes out. Gear 5th lets us take our mind off to more happy and goofy things. Same exact thing for the characters when they see Luffy as Nika. It's a sigh of relief and happiness for them. Or at least it's definitely going to be as we head deeper into the final saga. Can't wait for Kuma to finally see Luffy as Nika. I could not have put this any better myself. You've hit the nail exactly on the head in my opinion. I think that Gear 5th, the idea that's been built up so much that it is this joyous warrior of liberation, and it's what everybody dreams of. Everybody who's suffering through so much darkness, through so much suffering, what they're dreaming of above all else is just, wouldn't it be nice if there was just some magical warrior that could come through and turn, this whole dark, gloomy world upside down, fill it with joy, sunshine, laughter, freedom, jubilation, all of that stuff, right? It's meant to feel like a dream, just a dream for these slaves, for all of these people suffering. But the idea is that we are actually going to get to see that dream manifest. That is the point of Nika, that is the point of Luffy being the new Joy Boy. That is what I think this whole little backstory section even that we're getting is leading up to, right? We're getting all the suffering from Kuma. We're getting all the suffering from Bonnie. We've seen through 3 generations, Clap, Kuma, Bonnie, they've all dreamed of this concept of Nika that can come and just alleviate all of the pain that they're experiencing and just pull back all of the darkness, crush these oppressors that have been holding them down. We're getting all of this suffering through Kuma's backstory. We know it's leading back to the present, where right now Saturn is actively holding down Bonnie. He's a force of oppression right there in front of them. Kuma is likely going to make his way to the island as well in a half-dead state, completely broken, beaten near the final moments of his life. The most important thing that could just make all of this feel so much better right now would be kind of the clouds just part and we get to see Luffy as this laughing, joyous warrior in the midst of it all, just absolutely wreck Saturn and get to show Bonnie just the power of freedom, the joy of just being untethered, not being able to be held down by anybody, and just being able to show Bonnie a vision of the Celestial Dragons being helpless in the face of just this powerful, unbridled source of freedom. And for Kuma to have that be his final vision as well, something that can actually put a smile on his face after all of the pain and suffering that he's had to endure for years and years and years. So I 100% agree. I think Gear 5th is very fitting for the type of tone that One Piece is heading towards. You just need that in the midst of all of this darkness, because that is ultimately what One Piece is, and that ultimately is what Luffy himself is supposed to represent. So break next week, but definitely watch out for next Tuesday's video, which is breaking down the brilliance of Kuma's flashback so far and how it breaks the mold from all other flashbacks, and I will talk to you all next week.